Story 1. Girls' Night Out. My name is Susie, and I'm a 20-something woman living in Los Angeles. A few weeks ago, my friends and I planned a girls' night out in the city to unwind from the hustle and bustle of our busy lives. We were having a great time, but little did we know that this night would turn into a living nightmare that we would never forget. It was a typical Friday evening when we all got together in my friend Lisa's apartment. The 5 of us, Lisa, Emily, Sarah, Hannah, and I, were all dressed up and ready to hit the town. We laughed, talked, and enjoyed each other's company. We visited a few bars, danced the night away, and had a lot of fun. It was around 2 a.m. when we decided to head back to our homes. We were driving on the freeway when suddenly our car broke down. The engine sputtered, and the car came to a stop. We were stranded, and none of us knew how to fix the car. We tried calling for help, but there was no signal on our phones. We were stuck in the middle of nowhere, 100 miles away from the city, with no help in sight. We were all getting nervous, and the eerie surroundings didn't help. It was pitch black, and the only light came from our car's headlights. We could hear the sound of crickets and owls in the distance. The silence was deafening. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise. We looked around, but there was no one in sight. Then, we saw a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. It was coming towards us, and we couldn't make out what it was. Our hearts were pounding, and we were terrified. We locked the car doors and turned off the headlights. We didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. The shadowy figure came closer, and we could see that it was a man. He looked like he had been living in the woods for a long time. He had a wild look in his eyes, and his clothes were tattered. We didn't know what to do, but we knew we had to protect ourselves. We all reached for anything that could be used as a weapon. I grabbed a tire iron, and the others found sticks and rocks. We were ready to fight if we had to. The man came up to our car and started banging on the window. We could see his face clearly now, and he looked angry. He was yelling and screaming at us, but we couldn't understand what he was saying. We were all scared out of our minds. Suddenly, the man stopped yelling and walked away. We breathed a sigh of relief and tried to calm down. But the calm was short-lived. We heard another noise, and this time it was coming from the woods. We could hear the sound of branches snapping and twigs breaking. We looked towards the direction of the sound, but we couldn't see anything. Our hearts were racing, and we were all scared. We didn't know what was happening, but we knew we had to get out of there. We decided to leave the car and start walking. We didn't know where we were going, but we had to get away from there. We walked for what felt like hours, but we couldn't find any help. The only thing we saw was a lone gas station in the distance. We walked towards it, hoping to find someone there who could help us. When we arrived, we saw that it was closed. There was a sign on the door that said it was closed for repairs. We were all disappointed and scared. We didn't know what to do. We sat on the ground, hoping that someone would come along and help. As we sat there, huddled together, trying to figure out what to do next, we heard a truck approaching in the distance. We all looked up and saw headlights coming towards us. At first, we felt relieved, thinking that finally, someone had come to our rescue. The truck pulled up next to us, and a man stepped out. He was tall and muscular, wearing a trucker hat and a flannel shirt. He had a thick beard and looked like he had seen a lot in his life. He asked us if we needed any help, and we explained our situation to him. He said he could help us and offered to give us a ride back to the city. We were hesitant at first, given our recent experience with the strange man in the woods, but we were also desperate. We climbed into the back of the truck, grateful for the ride. We talked amongst ourselves, relieved to be getting out of this scary situation. The trucker didn't say much, but we didn't think much of it at the time. We were just happy to be getting away from the deserted gas station. As we drove down the lonely road, we noticed that the trucker was taking a route that we didn't recognize. The surroundings were becoming more and more desolate, and we felt uneasy. We asked him where he was taking us, and he didn't say anything. He just kept driving. Suddenly, the truck came to a stop, and the driver turned around to face us. We could see his face more clearly now, and it looked different than before. His skin was pale, and his eyes were dark and empty. It was like he was no longer human. We screamed and tried to open the truck door, but they were locked. We were trapped. The driver got out of the truck and walked around to the back where we were sitting. He opened the door and dragged us out one by one. We were too scared to fight back, too scared to run. The trucker led us to a small, abandoned shack in the woods. It was dark and musty, and we could hear strange noises coming from inside. We were pushed inside and locked in. We huddled together, trying to stay calm, but we knew that our lives were in danger. We didn't know what was going to happen to us. Hours passed, and we were all too scared to speak. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise outside the shack. We looked at each other, fear in our eyes. The door opened, and a group of men walked in. They looked like the man we saw earlier, all wild and untamed. They surrounded us, and we were trapped. They didn't say anything, just looked at us with hungry eyes. We knew then that we were going to be killed or worse. We were too afraid to move or speak. But then, something unexpected happened. A bright light filled the room, and the men scattered like roaches. We looked up and saw a group of people dressed in white, holding bright flashlights. They came towards us and freed us from our bindings. We were rescued, but we were also traumatized. We didn't talk to anyone for weeks after that, too scared to share our story. We were just grateful to be alive.
Story 2, The Lady Hitchhiker. I remember it like it was yesterday. The eerie surroundings, the lonely street, the old car I was driving, and the lady that hitched a ride with me. It all started on one of the loneliest stretches of Freeway, the US Route 50, where rumors of a lady taking lifts from lone male drivers had been circulating for years. I never believed in those stories, so I didn't think much of it. It was late at night and I was driving back home after a long day at work. The road was empty and I was the only one driving. The moon was bright, casting shadows of the surrounding trees on the road, making it look like a scene from a horror movie. I had my music on and was lost in my thoughts when suddenly, I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, waving her hand and asking for a lift. She was a beautiful lady, dressed in a long white dress and had a sweet smile on her face. I stopped the car and asked her where she was headed. She said she was heading to the next town and asked if I could give her a ride. I said yes, and she got into the car. We started talking, and she told me her name was Emily. She was soft-spoken, and her voice was soothing. We talked about everything, from our favorite movies to our jobs. I didn't feel alone anymore, and the journey became enjoyable. As we drove, I noticed something strange. Every time I looked at her, she seemed to be getting paler, and her smile was turning into a frown. Her hands were turning cold and her eyes were staring at me with a blank expression. I tried to ignore it, but it kept getting worse. Suddenly, the car started to act up. The headlights flickered and the engine started to make strange noises. I pulled over and Emily got out of the car. She started to walk away and I called after her, asking if she was okay. She turned around and I could not believe what I saw. Her eyes were black and her skin was pale, almost translucent. I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't budge. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, with a possible ghost on the loose. I started to panic, and that's when I remembered the old stories of victims that I had read in the news. All the victims were lone male drivers who had given a lift to a lady in white, just like Emily. They had all been found brutally murdered with no evidence or motive. I knew then that I had to get out of there, but I couldn't leave the car. I was trapped, and Emily was getting closer. Her eyes were fixed on me, and I could feel her cold breath on my neck. I closed my eyes and prayed for a miracle. Suddenly, I heard a sound, and I opened my eyes. It was a police car, and it had pulled over behind me. The officer got out of the car and asked me what was wrong. I told him everything, and he listened patiently. He then told me that I was lucky to be alive. He had heard of the lady ghost and had been patrolling the area, hoping to catch her. The officer gave me a lift back to the town, and I thanked him for saving my life. I never saw Emily again, but the experience left a lasting impression on me. I realized that ghosts were real and that I had been lucky to escape with my life. Looking back in hindsight, I remember reading the old stories of victims in the news. There was one about a young man who had given a lift to a lady in white and was found the next day, brutally murdered with his throat slit. Another story was about a truck driver who had given a lift to a lady in white, and when he woke up, he found himself tied up with the lady standing over him, holding a knife. He managed to escape, but not without scars, both physical and emotional. I shuddered at the thought of what could have happened to me if the police officer hadn't come along. The lady ghost, Emily, had seemed so innocent and sweet, but in reality, she was a cold-blooded killer. I wondered how many other innocent people had fallen prey to her charms.
Story 3. Children of the Woods. As we were driving back home after a week-long vacation, we were enjoying the scenic route through the mountains. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining and the birds were chirping. We were two young couples, Will and Emily in the front, while Sarah and I, James, sat in the back. The plan was to make a stop in a nearby town for lunch and then drive the rest of the way back home. But fate had other plans for us. Suddenly, the brakes failed, and Will tried his best to control the car, but it kept picking up speed. We were all terrified, and it felt like we were going to crash. But then, as if by some miracle, Will slammed the brakes and the car screeched to a halt just inches away from a group of children playing in the middle of the road. We were all in shock as we stepped out of the car, and by the time we had collected ourselves, the children had disappeared. At that time, we didn't think much of it as we were still getting a grip on ourselves and wondering how we survived. Will, being a mechanic who ran his own garage, quickly worked on the brakes before we got back in the car. We were relieved when the car started, and we continued our journey, feeling grateful to have been saved by the children. However, our relief was short-lived. Less than 10 minutes later, the brakes failed again, and strangely noticed the same children playing in the middle of the road. Will hit the brakes again, and the car came to a halt just inches away from the edge of the cliff. We were all in shock, but this time the children were still there. Sarah, being a kind-hearted person, ran towards the children, hoping to help them move to the side. But as she got closer, something strange happened. The children turned to face her, and we could see their faces clearly for the first time. They were disfigured, with twisted and distorted features, and their eyes seemed to glow red in the sunlight. We were all frozen in fear as we watched what happened next. The children started to move towards Sarah, their movements jerky and unnatural. We could hear their bones cracking as they moved, and their laughter was sinister and unsettling. Sarah tried to run back to the car, but it was too late. The children were upon her, and we watched in horror as they dragged her into the woods. We were all in shock, and our first instinct was to run, but we were trapped. The car was broken, and we were stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way out. We could hear Sarah's screams echoing through the woods, and it was clear that we were not alone. Something was out there, something evil and dangerous. We huddled together in the car, trying to come up with a plan, but we were paralyzed with fear. The woods around us seemed to come alive with strange noises and movements, and we could feel eyes watching us from the darkness. It was then that we noticed the words written on the trees around us. "Beware the children of the woods." We knew then that we were in grave danger, and we had to find a way to survive. Will tried his best to fix the car, but he just couldn't get his head around it. We were stuck, and our only hope was to make a run for it. We decided to leave the car and make a run for it through the woods, hoping to find Sarah and maybe some kind of help. It was a terrifying experience, running blindly through the woods, never knowing what was waiting for us at every turn. But we knew we had to keep moving. We eventually stumbled upon a small cabin in the woods, and we were relieved to find that it was occupied. The man who lived there was kind enough to help us and called for help. A few moments later, we saw Sarah emerge from the woods, but the look on her face told me that something was wrong. As she approached us, I could see that she was shaking and tears were streaming down her face. "What happened, Sarah?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush. I went over to the children and they turned around to face me. Their faces were deformed, Their eyes were huge and their skin was pale and translucent. They looked like they had been dead for years. I felt a shiver run down my spine at her words. It was hard to imagine what kind of children could be out here in the middle of nowhere, playing on the road. Sarah continued, I tried to talk to them, but they just stared at me with those dead eyes. And then, I heard something. It sounded like whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. And then, they just vanished. One moment they were there, and the next, gone. I exchanged a look with the others, and we all knew that we needed to get out of here as soon as possible. We quickly got back to the car, and this time Will managed to start it up, determined to get us out of this nightmare. But our relief was short-lived. Just as we were about to drive off, we heard the same whispering sound that Sarah had mentioned. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and louder until it was almost deafening. And then the car's headlights flickered and the car died on us. We were plunged into total darkness, with only the eerie sound of the whispering filling our ears. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, but there was no signal out here. Suddenly Will's phone rang, and he answered it. Hello? It was the operator from 911, who Will had tried reaching out to while we were waiting in the cabin. We had finally managed to get through, and they were sending a rescue team to our location. It was like a huge weight had been lifted off our shoulders, and we finally allowed ourselves to breathe. As we waited for the rescue team to arrive, we wanted to find out more about the strange occurrences in the area. We decided to do some research on our own, and we started to dig into the history of the mountains. We soon discovered that the area we were in was known for a tragedy that occurred many years ago. A group of children had died in a fire, and their spirits were said to still haunt the area. It all started to make sense. The children we had seen on the road were not alive, and their screams were echoes from the past. We had unknowingly stumbled upon a haunted place, and we were lucky to have made it out alive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rescue team arrived, and we were taken to safety. We made it home that night, but the memory of the haunting experience stayed with us for a long time. We never forgot about the children we saw on that lonely mountain road, and we always wondered if there were other lost souls trapped in the woods. But one thing was certain, we had all learned to appreciate life a little more after that terrifying encounter.